Today we're looking at something that might sound a little bit like a fever dream.
Yeah.
America before income tax.
Mm-hmm.
You heard that right.
Wow.
A time when every single dollar you earned was yours to keep.
Really?
No IRS, no deductions, just pure, unadulterated paycheck joy.
I like it.
But was it really this financial utopia, it sounds like?
Yeah, that's a good question.
But that's what we're here to figure out.
Yeah, it's funny how we often romanticize the past, but when it comes to this period in U.S. history, there's a lot more to the story than just no income tax, yay.
Right.
For a big chunk of U.S. history, the government basically ran on tariffs.
Tariffs.
Yep, those taxes you pay on imported goods.
So no income tax, just tariffs.
That's right.
I can already hear some people saying, bring that back.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing it wasn't quite that simple, was it? What did this system actually look like back in the day?
Well, imagine a time when the U.S. government spent a tiny fraction of what it does today, like 0.05%.
0.05%.
Yeah, that kind of fiscal restraint was possible because tariffs were the main source of income.
Right.
It meant the government had to be much more careful about what it spent money on.
Wow. 0.05%. That's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about all the things we take for granted today. Social Security, healthcare programs, infrastructure projects, all funded by taxes. It's hard to fathom a government operating on such a lean budget. Okay, so we've got this tariff-based system humming along, seemingly keeping the government afloat.
Right.
What happened? What caused this seismic shift to the income tax system we have today?
1913.
1913.
That's the year everything changed.
Yeah.
It wasn't just one thing, though. It was a perfect storm of three major events that completely reshaped the financial landscape of the U.S. It's like someone flipped the game board, changed all the rules, and said, okay, let's play again.
Okay, 1913, a year of massive change.
Yeah.
Give us the rundown. What were these three earth-shattering events that changed everything?
First, you had the 16th Amendment. This is the one everyone points to because it gave the federal government the power to directly tax people's income. At first glance, the rate seemed pretty low, ranging from 1% to 6%.
1 to 6%.
But think about it. This was a brand new power for the government. It's kind of like giving someone a little taste of chocolate. They're going to want more, right?
Hold on. If the rates were so low at the beginning, why were people so freaked out about income tax?
Yeah.
I mean, wouldn't they be happy to contribute a little bit if it meant funding important things? What am I missing here?
It's not just about the initial rates. It's about the principle of the thing. Imagine living your whole life knowing that the money you earned was yours, period. And then suddenly the government says, hey, we're going to take a cut of your earnings now. Even if it's a small cut, it represents a fundamental shift in the relationship between the government and its citizens. It's about control, autonomy, and the idea of personal property.
Right.
People were suspicious. It felt like the government getting its foot in the door, and they weren't sure what would happen next.
Yeah, I get that. It's like when you lend your friend $1 and they never pay you back. It's not about the dollar, it's the principle. Okay, so we have the 16th Amendment opening the door to income tax. What were the other two dominoes that fell in 1913?
The second big event was the creation of the Federal Reserve.
The Federal Reserve.
Now, this might seem totally unrelated to taxes, but think about it. The Federal Reserve gave the government the ability to print money.
Yeah.
Combine that with the new power to tax income, and suddenly the government has a lot more financial wiggle room. It's like going from a piggy bank to a high-limit credit card.
Okay, so more ways to collect money and the ability to print more.
Right.
It's starting to feel like those low initial tax rates weren't going to stay low for very long.
Yeah.
What was the third game changer?
The third event was a little less direct, but just as important, the switch to direct election of senators.
Direct election of senators.
Before this, senators were chosen by state legislatures. But with direct elections, the power shifted more toward larger, more populous cities, and that likely had an impact on how people thought about tax policy.
Interesting. So in a way, it was a power shift from rural areas, which might have been more reliant on trade and therefore tariffs, to urban areas, which might have been more open to the idea of income tax.
Exactly, and it all happened in 1913. These three events, the 16th Amendment, the Federal Reserve, and direct election of senators, fundamentally changed the relationship between the government and its citizens' money. It set the stage for the larger government, higher spending, and of course, the complex tax system we have today.
Okay, so we've established that 1913 was a pivotal year in U.S. financial history.
Yeah.
But now let's play a little thought experiment. What if by some twist of fate, we went back to a tariff-only system today? No income tax, just tariffs. What would that look like?
Interesting question.
Could it actually work?
That's a great question, and one that I know many people have pondered. On the surface, the idea of no income tax sounds incredibly appealing, all right?
Absolutely. Who wouldn't want to keep their entire paycheck?
Yeah.
But let's be realistic here. The U.S. government needs a lot of money to function. Could tariffs really generate enough revenue to cover all those expenses?
Well, let's look at the numbers. The U.S. government currently collects around $5 trillion in taxes annually. Tariffs only account for about 2.23% of that, which is roughly $111.5 billion.
So unless we're talking about slapping tariffs on literally everything,
Yeah,
it seems like a tariff-only system would fall drastically short of what's needed to run the country.
you're absolutely right. We'd be talking about a major financial shortfall, and that raises a whole bunch of questions about the potential consequences for everyday Americans.
Okay, let's dig into those consequences. What are the potential impacts of relying solely on tariffs in today's world? All right, so we're facing a potential budget black hole if we ditch income tax and go all in on tariffs.
Yeah.
But before we dive into the nitty-gritty of how that would impact you,
Right.
let's talk about what those impacts might actually look like.
Well, first and foremost, you'd probably see a significant increase in the prices of everyday goods, especially anything imported. Think electronics, clothing, even groceries. When businesses have to pay more for imported goods because of tariffs, guess who ends up fitting the bill?
Let me guess, the consumer.
That's right, the consumer.
So basically, we're trading those income tax deductions for higher prices at the checkout line.
Yeah.
But wouldn't this also be a boon for U.S.-based businesses? If imported goods get more expensive, wouldn't that give American companies a competitive edge?
It's not quite that straightforward.
Okay,
While some U.S. manufacturers might see a boost from reduced competition,
right.
there are a lot of other businesses that rely heavily on imports.
Okay.
Think about retailers who sell imported products or companies that use imported components in their manufacturing process. They'd all face higher costs,
Right.
and that could lead to job losses even if some sectors see gains.
So it's not as simple as tariffs, good, income tax, bad. It's a complex web of potential winners and losers. And what about the impact on the global economy? I mean, we live in a pretty interconnected world, right?
Absolutely. You can't just raise tariffs without expecting some pushback from other countries. Think about it. If we slap tariffs on goods from China,
Right.
they're likely to retaliate with tariffs on our exports.
Makes sense.
That's how trade wars start. And those rarely end well for anyone. We're talking disruptions to global supply chains, potential shortages of certain goods, and you guessed it, even more inflation.
So we've got potential price hikes, economic uncertainty,
Yeah.
and the risk of global trade wars.
A recipe for disaster.
It's starting to feel like a bit of a gamble, to say the least. But some people argue that it's a gamble worth taking. They say the short-term pain of higher prices would be outweighed by the long-term gain of a stronger, more self-reliant U.S. economy. What do you make of that argument?
It's definitely a perspective we need to consider. The idea is that tariffs would incentivize companies to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., creating jobs and boosting the economy in the long run.
Right.
It's like ripping off a bandage. It might hurt at first, but ultimately it leads to healing.
Okay, I can see the logic there.
Yeah.
But isn't it also possible that companies would simply move their manufacturing to other countries with lower tariffs rather than bringing it back to the U.S.? I mean, businesses are all about maximizing profits.
That's a valid point.
Yep.
And it highlights one of the key challenges with tariffs. You can't fully control how businesses will react. There's always the risk of unintended consequences.
Okay, so the short-term pain, long-term gain argument is a bit shaky.
Yeah.
What are some of the other arguments in favor of tariffs?
Another common one is the national security argument.
Okay.
The idea is that relying too heavily on other countries for essential goods, especially during times of crisis, can be dangerous. Think back to the early days of the pandemic when there was a mad scramble for face masks and other medical supplies. We were caught flat-footed because we relied so heavily on imports for those things.
Yeah, that was a wake-up call for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Suddenly, something as basic as a face mask became a strategic asset. So the argument is that tariffs would encourage domestic production of essential goods, even if it means they're a bit more expensive, just to ensure we have a reliable supply in case of emergencies.
Exactly. It's about prioritizing resilience and self-sufficiency over cost-cutting. Some people call it the better safe than sorry approach to national security.
That makes sense, especially in today's uncertain world. What's another argument we hear in favor of tariffs?
Well, there's the argument that tariffs are essentially a way to tax foreigners
Tariff orders.
and use that revenue to benefit Americans.
Okay, help me out here. How exactly does a tariff on, say, Chinese steel tax the Chinese?
The idea is that when you impose a tariff on a good imported from China, the Chinese producer either has to absorb that cost cutting into their profits or they have to raise their prices, making their product less competitive. Either way the argument goes, it's the Chinese who are paying the price, not Americans.
So it's like using tariffs as a leverage point to influence the behavior of foreign producers and governments. Interesting. Okay, we've covered some of the main arguments in favor of tariffs, but let's be honest, no policy is without its critics, and tariffs are no exception. What are some of the counter-arguments we need to consider?
The biggest one is probably the impact on consumers, especially those with lower incomes. As we talked about earlier, tariffs tend to drive up prices, and that can hit lower income households the hardest. Remember, tariffs don't take income levels into account.
Okay.
So a wealthy person and a low-income person buying the same imported product would both pay the same tariff amount, even though it represents a much bigger chunk of the low-income person's budget.
That's a really important point. It's not just about whether we want to pay taxes or higher prices. It's about who ends up bearing the brunt of those costs. What are some other concerns people raise about tariffs?
Well, we've already touched on the risk of trade wars, which could disrupt global supply chains and harm both U.S. exporters and consumers. But there's also the concern that tariffs can be a pretty blunt instrument. They don't always achieve their intended goals.
Right.
And they can sometimes have unintended consequences.
Okay, I'm curious to hear more about that.
Right.
Can you give us an example of how tariffs can backfire?
Sure. Let's talk about the fentanyl crisis.
Okay.
Some people have proposed using tariffs as a way to pressure countries like China and Mexico to crack down on fentanyl production and trafficking. The idea is that by threatening tariffs on their goods, we could force them to take more aggressive action against the sources of fentanyl.
So it's about using economic leverage to achieve a public health goal. I can see the logic there, but does it actually work?
That's where things get tricky. Critics argue that tariffs are unlikely to be effective in curbing illicit drug flows. Drug traffickers are notoriously good at finding ways around obstacles, so they might simply shift their routes or find new ways to smuggle fentanyl into the country.
And wouldn't that just drive the trade further underground, potentially making it even harder to control?
Exactly. And there's also the concern that tariffs, while intended to target the bad actors, could end up harming legitimate businesses and even fueling the black market. Imagine, for example, that we impose tariffs on certain chemicals imported from China that are used in the production of fentanyl. Well, those same chemicals might also be used in the production of legitimate pharmaceuticals or other products. So you end up hurting those businesses, and you might even create a shortage of those chemicals, which would then drive up prices on the black market, making it even more profitable for the drug traffickers.
Like playing whack-a-mole. You try to stamp out the problem in one place and it just pops up somewhere else.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And it highlights the complexity of this issue. There are no easy answers.
Right.
And sometimes the solutions we come up with can create as many problems as they solve.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the history of tariffs, the pros and cons of a tariff-only system, the economic and national security arguments, and even the unintended consequences of using tariffs to address complex problems like the fentanyl crisis.
Yeah.
What's the takeaway message here for our listeners? I mean, we've thrown a lot of information at them.
I think the key takeaway is that there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to tariffs. It's a nuanced issue with trade-offs that each individual needs to weigh carefully.
Right. It's not as simple as tariffs good or tariffs bad. It really depends on your values, your priorities, and your understanding of the complex economic and political forces at play. And I think that brings us back to the fundamental question we started with. What kind of America do we want?
Exactly. Do we want an America that prioritizes low prices above all else, even if it means relying more heavily on foreign goods? Or do we want an America that prioritizes domestic manufacturing and self-sufficiency, even if it means paying a bit more for certain things?
Those are big questions, and there are no easy answers.
Yeah.
But that's what makes this such a fascinating topic to explore. And we're not done yet. It's interesting how this whole tariff discussion really boils down to a much bigger question. About the role of government in our lives. Do we want a government that takes a more hands-off approach?
Right.
Letting the market dictate things like prices and production.
Right.
Or do we believe in a more active government that steps in to protect domestic industries, address social issues, and maybe even try to shape the global economy? It feels like we're constantly wrestling with that balance, and tariffs are just one piece of that puzzle.
That's a great observation, and it gets to the heart of the matter. This isn't just an economics debate.
Right.
It's a values debate. What do we as a society prioritize? What trade-offs are we willing to make? And those are questions that every generation has to grapple with.
And as we've seen, there are no easy answers. Even something as seemingly straightforward as a tariff can have ripple effects that we might not even anticipate. It's like those choose-your-own-adventure books we read as kids. Every decision leads you down a different path, and you never know quite where you'll end up.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating.
Yeah.
It forces us to think critically, to weigh different perspectives, and to acknowledge that there's no magic bullet solution that will make everyone happy.
Okay, so we've established that tariffs are complicated, that they can have both positive and negative consequences, and that they ultimately reflect our values and priorities as a society. But let's get back to the here and now.
Okay.
Why haven't we seen any serious proposals to ditch income tax and go back to a tariff-only system? I mean, I know it's not that simple,
Right.
but you'd think someone somewhere would at least float the idea, right?
Well, think about it from a political perspective. Any politician who proposes abolishing income tax is basically taking on a huge challenge.
Right.
Not only would they have to convince people that tariffs could actually generate enough revenue to fund the government, which, as we've discussed, is a pretty tall order, but they'd also have to overcome the inertia of the current system. People have gotten used to the idea of income tax, even if they don't love it.
Right.
And there are a lot of powerful interests that benefit from the status quo.
So it's not just about convincing voters that it's a good idea. It's about upending a whole system that's been in place for over a century.
Right.
That's a tough sell, even for the most charismatic politician.
Absolutely. And let's not forget that a lot of government programs and services that people rely on are funded by income tax revenue.
Right.
Think about things like Social Security, Medicare, education funding. If you suddenly take away that source of income, you'd have to make some tough choices about what to cut. And those are choices that most politicians would probably rather avoid.
Yeah, it's like trying to turn a giant ship around.
Exactly.
It takes a lot of time, effort, and frankly, a willingness to rock the boat, which is something most politicians try to avoid.
Exactly. And it's not just about the practical challenges, it's also about the psychological impact.
Yeah.
Imagine telling people, hey, guess what? You don't have to pay income tax anymore.
Right.
At first, everyone would be thrilled, right?
Yeah.
But then they'd start to worry, wait, what about my Social Security checks? What about funding for schools? What about national defense?
Yeah.
It could create a sense of uncertainty and anxiety, even if the transition was handled perfectly, which is never guaranteed.
So it's not just about the numbers, it's about the potential for social and political disruption.
Right.
It's like opening Pandora's box. You might release some good things,
Yeah.
but you're also likely to unleash a whole lot of chaos and unintended consequences.
That's a great way to put it. And it highlights the importance of having these conversations, of weighing the pros and cons, and of understanding the complexity of the issues at stake. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about tariffs or income taxes. It's about the kind of society we want to build and the values we want to uphold.
Well said. And, you know, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of tariffs, I think it's worth acknowledging that there might not be a perfect solution. Maybe it's not about finding the right answer,
Yeah.
but about finding the best possible balance.
Right.
The one that works for the most people, while acknowledging that there will always be trade-offs and compromises.
I think that's a really important point. We often get caught up in the search for the perfect solution,
Right.
but in reality, most policy decisions involve finding the least bad option, the one that minimizes harm while maximizing benefits. And that requires a willingness to engage in thoughtful debate, to listen to different perspectives, and to acknowledge that we might not always get everything we want.
So true.